They are. So thank you everyone for joining us for episode 3 of the Backbench podcast. I'd like to start off firstly by saying thank you to our guest tonight, Mr. Alex Gore-Hamilton, who is the leader of the Scottish Liberal Democrats and is also a member of the Scottish Parliament for the constituency of Edinburgh Western. Thank you very much for joining us, Mr. Gore-Hamilton. So for the past just more than a month, obviously we've had the incursion in Ukraine by the Russian Federation, which has seen worldwide condemnation. You have been quite outspoken, as many have, about the invasion, and you've also attended many of the Ukrainian solidarity protests, which we were talking about before the recording, about how we went to one where we marched from the Russian consulate to Holyrood, which saw, I would say, more than 1,000 or so people show up to that. And I wanted to start with my first question with the invasion. Scotland has made many moves to show support towards Ukraine in various ways in the past month. What more do you think Scotland could do, or what more, in fact, do you think the UK could do to better help Ukraine, whether it be militarily, financially, or through aid?
Well, Caitlin, there's a lot to unpack in that question. And I think it's firstly important to recognize the cloud under which we meet, the threat to really the order of international relations that we understood to be true, and that we are entering a dark and dangerous new paradigm. On the 24th of February, Vladimir Putin didn't just invade a territorial sovereignty of Ukraine. He demonstrably broke international law. He took his country back to a state of near totalitarianism. And nobody really knows where that ends. So, I mean, yeah, I've been proud to be involved with the demonstrations and the marches. I was proud to march alongside you guys at one of them, in fact. But what more can we do? Well, I mean, one of the problems is that our options are very limited as to what do we do. The first is a humanitarian response. That's one thing we can certainly do. And yet the Conservative government at Westminster are not making that easy. We saw the sort of unedifying spectacle in the first days of invasion of Junior Minister to Priti Patel suggesting that people could come and sign up as fruit pickers for the summer, and that would be a way to get out of Ukraine. That is not the Britain I recognise. The Britain I recognise was in the response to the Homes for Ukraine initiative, where 150,000 Brits signed up overnight to say, look, I have a room in my house, or I have a spare property I don't use, and I want to host a Ukrainian family. But we're still making it hard to connect those people. So number one, we need to waive the visas, all visas, in the same way that the European Union have done. Immediately waive them and do so for 3 years for anyone who wants to come here. There is a surfeit of accommodation for them, so we need to do that. Secondly, I think we need to continue what we're doing in terms of military aid. Now, Scotland doesn't really have a role in that. That's a UK decision, but Volodymyr Zelensky did applaud the UK for what we've done in terms of lethal and non-lethal military aid. And then thirdly is sanctions, but it's more than just the role pulling our companies out of Russia and severing economic ties. It's about ridding our country and our politics of dirty Russian money. And that, for me, begins with the immediate rescinding of the peerage of Lord Hampton in Liberia, Medvedev, who was given that peerage by Boris Johnson. And I am deeply uncomfortable about Russian influence in our politics. It's a lot there. It's a big subject.
It's definitely a big subject. And just a quick follow-up on the question of immigration. Obviously, the British government has shown vigorous support towards Ukraine, at least as we've seen in words. Why do you think that when it comes to immigration, the government has so far been kind of hesitant to, as you say, scrap the visas at least for 3 years and allowing people to actually come to Britain?
One word: ideology. This is a Conservative government that hates immigration. hates it, and in fact campaigned against it, campaigned on it, campaigned for Brexit about it, is suggesting that we would have fewer foreign people in this country. And unfortunately, that's the gutter politics of the Conservatives' hard right flank. And they are still anxious about that flank. They're still worried that if they go too soft on it, then they'll lose support. But I'm sorry, this is about offering safe harbor to people fleeing the actions and the persecutions of a certified war criminal. We don't have time to muck around with paperwork. Our country, our Britain, has a proud tradition of philanthropy and in opening our doors to refugees, whether that's the kinder transport, whether that's the Biafran refugees. There's a proud tradition, and the Conservatives, I think, are still stuck. I'm really glad to see that the response of the British people, I think, has caused them time to rethink that and actually say we've misjudged public opinion on this, and I hope very much they will change.
Thank you.
Yeah, no, definitely want to get into sort of the military aspects of a lot of this conflict, but I did want to ask a follow-up because I'm just interested in the things you're saying about visas and immigration and that kind of stuff. I think it's been very unsettling watching this entire crisis happen just because it's so proximate to where we are, and it's just happened in such a rapid period of time, and it's been millions of people. And I think for a lot of people who are watching this situation unfold, along with those, humanitarian feelings of what can I be doing, I think the larger question that I think I'm confused about and a lot of people are confused about is where do all these people go? Because it's millions and millions of refugees that aren't just going. It's not one country that's accepting them all. Are they going to be permanently displaced? Are they going to be able to go back home? What is the path forward, and how should we be navigating how we're going to manage this as in Europe, in NATO, in just a larger global sense?
Well, these questions, I think, are dominating, the minds of every administration in the free democracies of the world right now, because this is uncharted territory. We have never seen in our lifetime, certainly, the mass exodus of people in such a short space of time. 4 to 5 million people on the road outside of Ukraine, another 6 to 8 million people internally displaced within Ukraine. Now, a lot of those people will want to stay close. You can understand that. If you had to leave your home, you would want to stay relatively close so that you, if you could get back to your home and your property, then you could do so in short order. But the sad truth is that for many citizens, the 500,000 people who lived in Mariupol, they don't have a city to go back to. It will take years to rebuild that city. That's going to happen, I fear, in places like Chernihiv and Kharkiv, again, which are facing that same encirclement and that relentless bombardment. So we need to be ready for the long haul with this. And so the Homes for Ukraine thing is great, but it's not sustainable for many years. I think most people will sign up and they say, yeah, I can have a family for 6 months, and that's great. But ultimately, not all of those placements will go beyond that, and yet there will be need for that. So we need to start thinking about housing long term. If we take 100,000 refugees into Britain, or 150,000 refugees, what are we going to do with them if this is for the long term? It shouldn't be a barrier to that happening, but it should be a consideration. And there aren't answers yet, Quinn, to these questions, I'm afraid.
Yeah. And I guess that sort of plays into what you were saying about there's sort of a dark cloud that's settling over the host of Europe and much of the international community of feeling this sort of dark paradigm shift that I think a lot of people haven't really felt the kind of tension since, kind of like Cold War dynamics, or we saw the similar buildup pre-World War II, pre-World War I, this sort of dark, unsettling time. And part of it, of course, is the humanitarian aspect of you're watching these grave violations against humanity occur to so many civilians on the ground in Ukraine. But a larger part of it is, of course, what exactly are our governments going to do about it? And that sort of fundamental tension of what should they be doing? Is military response the most appropriate response to this, or should it just be humanitarian? And so when we talk about the larger picture, of course, we're thinking about NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. But I guess as the conflict is in Ukraine and Ukraine is not part of that organization, what is sort of the UK as a member to NATO's role in that conflict. I think that when we think about NATO, there's usually sort of a balance of power aspect to it, going to defensive alliances. There were, of course, the Allied and the Axis powers in World War II. And then throughout the Cold War, it was NATO versus a lot of the Soviet Union sort of subsidiary states in the Eastern Bloc. But now it sort of feels like this large defensive alliance, and it's not clear exactly what anyone's supposed to do with that. So is a NATO intervention in Ukraine really something that's palpable, or something that we can feel is coming, if that makes sense?
So there's a few things to unpack in that question. It's a really good question. I think the first thing I would say is that, yes, it's a dark time, and the response of the West is still uncertain. However, I mean, one thing I think that this is that we should celebrate, and I don't think Vladimir Putin expected, is that this has awoken, and in short order awoken, a consensus in the free democracies of the world that had all but fallen away since the end of the Cold War. And immediately, practically in a heartbeat, we reassessed what we valued, what we were worried about, and how we could hunt as a pack, as it were. And you saw, Germany rearming. They've got a Green Party foreign affairs minister, and yet they are rearming for the first time since the Second World War. And we're celebrating that because we recognize that we need Germany to pull its weight in terms of military security. I think your question about, defensive alliances and what's our role, it's a really good one. But then, this was caused by Vladimir Putin. We had this fragile balance that existed for as long as each of the alliance and the Russian Federation, the NATO alliance and the Russian Federation, kept within the confines of their own borders and played the rules of the game. Now, Putin's been taking little bites out of that consensus for the best part of 10 years, started in 2014, the annexation of Crimea, then you've got Georgia and South Ossetia and the Donbass and all of that. And until now, people thought, oh, we don't like that. But then there was always this narrative that says there's a Russian diaspora there, and they all look quite happy. And it was relatively bloodless, although let's not forget, the valiant efforts of the Ukrainians to fight in the Donbass and Donetsk regions over the last 6 years. But then this changed everything. He's invaded a sovereign territory, one which was potentially an accession state to the European Union, and one that was a buffer zone. And I remember it being chilled to the bone by a tweet I saw the day before the invasion on the 24th. Do you remember? He sent what he called peacekeepers into Donetsk and Donbass.
Yeah,
and
signed declarations of independence for those regions.
That's right.
At first, we thought that's what it was going to be, but then no one could have expected the entire, national invasion. Sorry, didn't mean to interrupt.
No, you're right. And you remember your former president Donald Trump saying that's amazing, that's brilliant, what a great idea to call them peacekeepers. And I remember seeing this chilling tweet that somebody said, Putin won't stop at Donbass, and then Putin won't stop at Ukraine. And that's the thing, because I think that had this gone Putin's way, he would have consolidated in Ukraine. If his intelligence apparatchiks had been right and they were going to be welcomed with flowers and a puppet government installed, I think he would have paused there probably for the next 4 or 5 years, just consolidated that, treated Ukraine like Belarus, and then mounted a much bigger assault on a country like Poland or the Balkans, or the Baltic states rather. And I think that was the point at which, he was testing the resolve of the West. And he's made 2 massive miscalculations, but well, we can come on to, did you ask about NATO, whether we should send NATO in or whether that's palatable?
Yeah, I mean, it sort of feels like there's this huge defensive alliance and there's so many terrible things that are happening right now. And it sort of feels like, at what point is NATO going to come in? Because of course, like, that would have to reach Poland, that would actually have to reach a NATO member country. But that being said, at what point are we going to say we're not going to get involved, but subsequently most of Ukraine has then been engulfed by the Russians, if that makes sense? There's sort of a balancing act going on.
It's hard to see the circumstances on which either we put boots at NATO put boots on the ground or wings in the air over Ukraine, because well, for all the reasons I think they've been rehearsed many, many times since the 24th of February. A no-fly zone, it depends what you're wanting it to do. The first, the no-fly zone in 1991 over Iraq was there to stop Saddam Hussein sending missiles to his own people, bombing his own people. Then there was a no-fly zone over Libya when the British helped and Americans actually helped bring in close air support to fight Gaddafi's forces. But you don't have a no-fly zone that just stops cruise missiles. It exists, and if you put planes in the sky, Russia will put planes in the sky, and you need to then be prepared for engagement, and that's a hot war between NATO and Russia. Where does that lead? I think there's a point, though, you can see where the tension is such that NATO have to do something, because whether that's a biological weapons attack on Ukrainian soil, whether it's a show of strength with the detonation of a nuclear device, perhaps over the Black Sea. I've heard that sort of rumored that Putin might do that. That cannot go unanswered, but it's going to require some real statecraft to work out what that response looks like.
Yeah. Just as a quick follow-up, I think that even within questions of NATO and NATO membership, so much of this, well, it's not entirely possible to be determinate to say this is clearly what President Putin is thinking about X, Y, and Z, because so much of it seems irrational and illogical, and there's no clear pattern or strategy a lot of the time. But it seems, I think, ironic to me when I'm thinking about NATO and NATO's participation in this conflict is that one of those key sort of wedge issues between the NATO parties and President Putin was this sort of Russian veto over Ukraine's accession into NATO and being able to say, no, that's our final buffer between you and us. We don't want it. We don't want you there. But subsequently, the invasion of Ukraine, I feel ironically, has actually, it sort of works against his own argument, because it just makes all of the bordering states, it makes all of the bordering states, whether that be, I mean, the Ukrainian government or Sweden, or I think it's Finland. I mean, those are all now very scared countries about a potential invasion. And it just seems that totally worked against him in the fact that maybe these countries wouldn't have considered joining NATO, but I
think that's right. And I actually met with 3 of their ambassadors last week, Norway, Finland, and Sweden, just talking about, obviously, some of them are already in NATO. But it's interesting what you say about, Putin's state of mind. And I think that this is a really interesting question. I think it's wrong and to suggest that he has gone insane. I think that this is actually something that's always been deep-rootedly ideological within Vladimir Putin, the idea of this kind of the Tsarist Russian borders that stretch much further, or at least the Soviet borders. And I think he is acting on what I believe is his desire to build legacy, because he must be in his 70s now. He doesn't look very well. There's suggestions he's not very well. But I think what's happened is that he has ended up being a victim of, and is now fighting, his own inherent corruption, and by which I mean the corruption of the high command of the Russian Empire, or the Russian Federation, and the skim that comes at every level in military procurement. That's why you get so many rich Russian oligarchs, is because everyone takes a taste. But it means that you end up with really rubbish equipment at the bottom of the pile, and also that you're surrounded by people who tell you what you want to hear, believe. And I think there's a really significant reason that, we heard that Putin fired a lot of his intelligence staff as soon as they weren't welcomed as liberators into Kyiv. I think he genuinely believed they were going to be. And final thing I'd say on this is very alarming, that General Shoigu, Chief of Defense Staff in Russia, and Valery Gerasimov, who is Chief of the Air Staff, I think, or another branch of the army, have not been seen in public since the 11th of March. And these are guys who have been at Putin's side for 20 years, and nobody knows where they are. And it's troubling, because I think that shows a kind of bunker mentality and a frustration, and nobody is really actually now advising Putin in any reasonable way.
Yeah.
Kind of going back to what you were saying earlier, I remember Quinn and I have talked about this with my other friends. I remember the night before the invasion, because I was on Twitter nonstop when it was coming up to that. I always think it's interesting at 2021, I'm getting most of my information from Telegram and Twitter when it comes to war, but here we are. I remember going right before I went to bed, there's just a tweet. Anthony Blinken says the invasion's happening tonight. And I kind of went, they've been saying that for a couple of nights. We'll see. You wake up that morning and obviously the troops are in. The invasion is started.
Not to interject, but I remember way back when former President Trump was saying that we were gonna go to war with North Korea tomorrow, and going to bed thinking, are we about to go to war? And then it woke up and it didn't happen. But then you wake up here and it obviously did happen.
And as Quinn and I are 21 and 20 respectively, we've talked about this is kind of our first war in a sense. Obviously, we were alive through Iraq and Afghanistan, but we were extraordinarily young. And now, we can comprehend what's occurring and what's happening. And I think it's quite interesting when you look at it. We have a question a bit about sort of the threat of nuclear war, because I've talked to my parents about this, who grew up during the Cold War. And my dad remembers in Canada doing the nuclear war, kind of getting under the desk, because that was going to do so much, but it was still, get under the desk and, the training for that. And I suppose it's quite interesting to see how there is kind of correlations between the Cold War and what's occurring at the moment. And my question is kind of, when we talked about how Ukraine was a buffer, not just for NATO, but also for the European Union, because now Russia is now on the doorstep of the EU, as Ukraine has gone, and now obviously Ukraine's asking to be a member of the European Union. So with that in mind, I suppose I was going to ask is, it's kind of the same question with what more can the UK do? What more can the EU do at that effect? Obviously, Volodymyr Zelensky has spoken multiple times at the European Union, at the European Parliament rather, and EU has given much financial help, but I suppose it's kind of going in circles, just finding another organization. Yeah. But it is the question, what more can they do in order to help?
What can the EU do? I think the EU can do several things. Firstly, it needs to wean itself off Russian oil and gas. It's starting to do that, but it needs to do that much, much faster. Second of all, I think they need to amplify the humanitarian response. It was a big, generous offer. They need to make sure that they make good on that offer, that they find places and spaces for all those refugees that they have invited to come. Thirdly, I think that the military alliance. There is a military alliance within the European Union. We are moving toward. They are moving towards greater integration of military capability. But what I would say is, I think this changes things in Britain too, because Brexit was all about isolationism, and that is just taken off the table for us now. We cannot walk forward in isolation anymore. This is the new paradigm. We discussed it as a new paradigm, and it will necessitate lockstep cooperation between the allied nations, by which I mean Britain, America, and the European Union, in terms of defensive procurement, defensive deployment, and the rest of it. But Caitlin, just to address your original point about nuclear war, I mean, I remember growing up in the Cold War, and I was born in 1977. So I was like, the Berlin Wall came down when I was about 13. So I remember it very clearly, and I remember it with a sense of relief, because there was that kind of terror. I used to have nightmares as a kid about nuclear Armageddon. And I am devastated that we are very likely now in a protracted period where that threat is a very real possibility. I don't think it's a probability, but it is always a possibility, because for as long as you have more than two massive nuclear powers, a world with nuclear powers who are effectively at each other's throats, then nobody's safe. There are a couple of things I think that I think we should be reassured, and your listeners should be reassured by, is that firstly, I don't think that Putin is on a death wish. This is a man who is intensely paranoid about infection and protecting himself. I don't think he would like to survive a nuclear holocaust and then die in the starvation of nuclear winter. Secondly, there are a lot of moving parts in Russian command and control. It's not like he has a red button underneath his desk. There are many people in that chain, and you would hope that if it was any nuclear release would be irrational, but if he was acting irrationally, then there would be a break in that chain. And then, finally, I don't think it would be like, if there was any kind of nuclear exchange, it would start small initially. I think because we have like battlefield nuclear weapons, there might be, and I think that's the most likely use of nuclear weapons, is that we might see that either as a demonstration detonation or their use in a battlefield context in Ukraine. And that so there would be chances then to let slip that knot of war a bit.
Yeah. No, and to quickly follow up on that, I mean, I guess like the way I've sort of seen it progressing, we're seeing that sort of the West is putting up really strong walls, whether that be sort of military and economic sanctions. There's the threat of NATO getting involved should Russia encroach on NATO territory in Poland or wherever that may be. I mean, is it not plausible that nuclear war is sort of like the final, mutually assured destruction, but I mean, should nuclear war sort of be that final act of fear, in the sense of Russia's military resources are depleting, those oligarchs have all of their financial assets frozen, they're in a chokehold, and that's subsequently putting President Putin's life at risk, clearly. And there's a walling up of most of the surrounding countries, maybe with the exception of someone like China. But I mean, doesn't that sort of seem the logical progression of he's running out of troops, he's running out of propaganda, he's running out of, all of these sort of options are failing him. So is nuclear war not a palpable threat?
I mean, I can't second guess the mind of this dictator, and he's a monstrous dictator. But I think, you talk about the oligarchs and the generals and people who are losing power and influence and money because of what's going on, and they realize now he's made a terrible mistake. You've got to hope that rather than them all agreeing that nuclear war is the best way, that they take him aside into a darkened room and say, Vladimir Vladimirovich, we thank you for your service. Here's a nice stasher on the Crimean coast, and goodbye to you, sir. I don't think that's where we are. I mean, it's certainly something that, and I remember listening to Mariella Frostrup on Times Radio talk about this, and I just immediately associated with her on this, because she said that since the 24th, and since he talked about putting nuclear weapons on high alert, this seed of dread in your stomach, and anyone who lived through the Cold War remembers what that was like, and that's just back, and I don't see it going away. And having to have a conversation with my 7-year-old daughter, Darcy, about what nukes do. So what's a nuke, Dad, and can it destroy the world? And how, kids her age shouldn't have to worry about that kind of stuff.
Yeah,
I suppose it's interesting you talk about as you talk about kind of the break in chain. Obviously, we have rumors that you've had quite a bit of mutinies taking place in Crimea and from on the Russian border of Russian troops who are refusing to, and even in Belarus with Belarusian military officials stopping the dictator there from getting involved in the war in the first place. So I think that is quite an interesting point to bring up.
But
as we come to the end, I just wanted to say thank you very much for taking the time today and joining us. It's definitely a conversation that isn't going to end, that perhaps might not end anytime soon. But
maybe you'll have me back and we can talk about it some more.
Of course.
We can.
Anytime you like.
So Caitlin, Quinn, I've really enjoyed this, and well done. This is a great show, and I will. You have a new listener in me, so I'm looking forward to what comes next.
Thank you very much
for coming in.